Good morning, folks. As you'll appreciate, it's a difficult one to follow, a talk on a massive project like SERP. It's been going for several years. We're going to go right down the scale now to a pilot year, a first year of a research project looking at one building. And really the topic of this is really a kind of neglected narrative of Scottish upland archaeology, the so-called Pictish buildings of northeast Perthshire, early medieval in date. The type site was excavated in the mid-90s, and it's timely because that's now been brought to publication by Martin Carver. And the work's kind of the background to it is really, as the Scottish Archaeological Research Framework points out, is the number of houses dating to the period sort of 400 to 1,000 is less than 10. But here we have a group in northeast Perthshire where we have between 50 and 100 of these buildings identifiable as earthworks. So this is where we are. And you know, arguably kind of one of the highlights of the northeast Perth survey was really the recognition of these buildings, really through combined air photographic and field survey, and it really highlighted the fact that in Strathardle and Glenshee we have these remarkable relic landscapes simply because of the light touch of agricultural improvements in those areas. So we have very well preserved earthwork landscapes. So the site that lays in the north of Glenshee and Strathardle's over to the west there. And at least 48 of these buildings with this distinctive group were identified in that survey. And at that time they were kind of recorded and proposed as a sort of separate category within the kind of array of medieval and later settlement. They were not conventionally rectangular, and it was often noted they had these rounded ends, and they ranged from between 10 metres to 30 metres, very elongated, and often had sort of bowed or curved ends to them, walls to them. Entrances and porches and little annexes, bits built on, are also seen to be a very common feature, and they usually have one or often two entrances at different parts. It was also noticed that they're rarely found beside later fern-tombs and shielings, etc. Conversely, they are found beside prehistoric monuments, whether they're roundhouse settlements or earlier monuments in that sense. Really, four main groups were identified, and Lair, the site in Glenshee I'm talking about, was one of those, which constitute about 50% of the total number of buildings put together. And at that time, the date was suggested has been anywhere from the end of the roundhouses into medieval periods. But dates were provided between 1993 and 1995 in the excavations at Pictish North by Glasgow University. And this really provided dates from around 700 to the mid-9th century, with reoccupation in the 11th and 12th centuries. And it found that they were constructed of turf and rubble layered walls on a stone foundation. And what I've done with these slides is I've shown sort of comparable buildings from Glenshee on the right with some of the photographs from the excavations at Pictish North. And you know, it illustrates the quite considerable variation in size of the buildings and their kind of complexity, etc. They've been interpreted as longhouses, really designed for both human occupation and overwintering of cattle and sheep, in the tradition of, you know, the black houses of Western Isles, for example. The buildings are commonly found on a slope with one end often narrowing, and it's suggested that this is the kind of byre end where animals are stalled. So really moving on to what we found at Glenshee this year, we wanted to choose a site in Glenshee to, you know, away from the Strathardle's glen, and we chose Lair partly because it is a kind of microcosm of the archaeology of Glenshee. It's got all of the kind of elements that we find reoccurring in these relic landscapes, and it all focuses around this ring cairn. You can see there's a collection of different Pictish type buildings. And some roundhouses of, you know, probable Bronze Age or Iron Age date. But really, the monument that dominates it is this fantastic ring cairn, which has a real presence in the landscape. And the two buildings which we're looking at, the longhouses we're looking at in this first year, are aligned directly with this cairn. So this is the commissioned survey from 1990, and we first of all done some topographical survey to see if there were any other features we could pick up there with a slightly higher resolution, and we carried out some geophysical survey, and this actually, given its upland setting, etc., really proved quite very successful, and you can see various anomalies there that we were able to pick up in the geophysics that then allowed us to devise our kind of strategy for the trenching. Fairly small scale trenching in this first year, really for us to assess the nature of the archaeology there. These slides are really for landscape setting. You can get a feel of, you know, this is looking up into the highland area, and from the building looking down into the strath. And this is really the key elements we found at one end of the building. And you can notice the cultivation scars over the top of this building as well. It has been ploughed at some time. But really, this is where the end, the rounded end of the building is. We found the turf bank, we found a large pit at one end, and we confirmed an entrance where the earthwork suggested the entrance was. The entrance is very similar, as a kind of rammed pebble kind of surface at where the earthwork suggested. The large pit, and I think this illustration shows quite difficult archaeology to pick out, very subtle. But you know, this is a convincing large post hole where we would expect to have found one, and a very well preserved piece of the bank here, well defined. And this turned up a number of iron artifacts I'll show later on, and we got secure dates for these. So we were very pleased with the result here in terms of how clear it showed up. It was also very different from the Picamic buildings, though, not the massive stone foundations. And it could be that these stones that were there were actually from the wall material itself. We also looked at the geophysical anomaly, this linear feature we saw running along underneath the longhouse at an angle, and this turned out to be a heavily charcoal-filled shallow trench, possibly a hedge or a fence line or something that's been cleared away before the longhouse had been built. Other end of the building, downslope, this would be our byre end. We found very little at all, very difficult to trace, and very little stonework and anything else. This really shows how shallow a lot of the archaeology on the site was. And we have been testing, we did evaluate the site for its sensitivity to chemical mapping and OSL dating, in addition to the usual sort of macrofossils, etc. So, kind of in a nutshell, that's what we've kind of got. It's a long building, and its neighbour, I'm thinking at the moment, maybe the house, if you like, and this may be more of a byre or storage function building. And these are the dates we got back, which are, you know, good as we'd expect, and you know, very much in the range for the Picamic buildings. And here we have some of the metalwork from the bank. And I think the interesting thing about this is that, you know, with one piece, the copper alloy piece is interesting, but also the ironwork itself is, there's not a huge amount of everyday ironwork from the period, if you like, simply because in this area, because so few settlements have been excavated. So we're looking into finding out more about this. So thinking a little bit about how the buildings may have looked and what they were for, etc. We can, of course, look at Scottish vernacular buildings, and we can get good parallels here. And Bruce Walker's been very useful in terms of talking to, in terms of parallels that we can find for construction types, etc. But looking further afield, you know, and appropriate for this conference is the idea that, you know, that these building types are all over northwest Europe at this time. And you know, in a sense, they've been kind of neglected as an area of study in many countries, and including in Scotland, where there is important in the post-medieval period, but really haven't attracted the study that they deserve. This reconstruction in Iceland brilliantly shows, I think you'll agree, something missing in the Northumbrian example here. In terms of where this one's positioned in Northumbria, I think in terms of insulation, I might want some turf around there. And it's been great. This conference has been an excellent opportunity for me to meet with colleagues, and including Daniel Poxma, who's been responsible for the fantastic reconstruction in Holland of this contemporary salt marsh turf house. So obviously from a very different environment, but the construction techniques, etc. It's all part of a kind of something that we'll clearly be looking into in terms of the sort of remit of the project down the line. It's important to us that we deliver this as a kind of community archaeology project, and we've involved everything from primary schools right through to lifelong learning in our approach there. And I think that while it's tempting to say upland sites aren't affected by development in the same way as perhaps with wind farms is perhaps the only time we would see these sites potentially being excavated. And while it's tempting to say these sites are there and they're safe, I think it's important to point out that there are changes, and the big threat here is, as you can see, is four-wheel drive and erosion through just this increased use of vehicles. So there are threats to this resource, particularly as we saw with it being so shallow. In terms of future plans, we've done some quite innovative large-scale upland geophysics, and this is something that we're going to pursue this year in terms of trying to look at the different elements in the landscape here, and perhaps maybe look at some of these little clearance cairns and field boundaries, etc. So very much down the line, the intention is to continue looking at this initial pair of buildings, but to branch the project out to look at the wider landscape in due course. Our policy is to publish everything, and so our interim report from last year is now online, and so you can follow the story at our website. Thank you very much.